Welcome to this YouTube video looking at negative externalities in production and consumption and how to solve the market failure resulting from those with a tax. Specifically, this video is going to look only at unit taxes or specific taxes, which are fixed fees charged by the government to a firm per unit that they sell. You can, of course, look at this same kind of concepts with an ad valorem tax. I'm just not going to look at that for this video, but you can, of course, look at that too. We have a lot of definitions to refresh. So first one is overconsumption or overproduction. And that's when the free market quantity is greater than the social optimum. Here I've got a graph. I've got on the left the negative production externality graph. That leads to the free market quantity, QFM, being higher than the social optimum. So the difference between them is the overproduction. On the right, we've got the negative consumption externality graph, and that leads to QFM again being higher than the QSO. There is overconsumption, and the quantity overconsumed is QFM minus QSO, it's a quantity. Refresh negative externalities, they're harmful impacts on third parties due to the production or consumption of the good or service. You can use slightly different vocab such as external costs. You could use MEB, a negative MEB, to indicate a negative consumption externality. You could use plus MEC to indicate a positive cost added to third parties, which means it's a negative production externality. Be careful when you use the word marginal. Marginal means just for that one unit, going from one unit to another unit. And that differs from the total, which is the sum of like all the units. So here I've got the illustration of those concepts. So I've got negative production externality, negative consumption externality, but it's just a marginal externality that I've drawn. Just the externality for that QFM unit, that unit itself, that last kind of 100th unit, that final 100th unit has an externality of that height that I've illustrated there. Remember, MSC exceeds MPC at every quantity when third parties are harmed. MPB exceeds MSB when third parties are harmed. Got to refresh all this vocab so you don't have it down already. Just add it to your notes. MSC, MPC, MSC equals MPC plus MEC. Marginal social costs equals marginal private costs plus marginal external costs. Same with marginal social benefits equals marginal private benefits plus marginal external benefits. I've got all these definitions here, so hit the pause button, write them down, but I don't want to go into them so much right now. You can, of course, use slightly different vocab. Right, a total externality is the sum of all the externalities produced for like all the units at QFM. So if QFM was like 100 quantity, it would mean the externality that the first unit made, and the second unit, and the third unit, all the way to the 100th unit. So you have the total externality produced by all 100 units. That would give you these highlighted areas. So it's like the shaded area between like the split curves up until QFM. That's obviously the slight shortcut to just shade in the split curves. If you want more details on it, you've got to take a look at those challenge questions in the externality series that I had. In terms of a welfare loss, what is that? That's the reduction in social welfare at the QFM compared to the QSO. Social welfare is not just about externalities. That's some incorrect interpretation. Social welfare is the sum of all the social benefits minus all the social costs. And society is the third parties plus any others in the transaction. Okay, to prove the idea that total welfare is not maximized at QFM, let's refresh the idea, and then we're going to look at how a tax can help out with that. So if you want to produce or consume at QFM and you have negative externalities, the total welfare is a little trickier. It's going to be the sum of the green area plus the red area. What I've done, I've added up all the MSBs minus all the MSCs. And up until QSO, the marginal social benefit was higher than the marginal social costs. So up until QSO, all these units were adding on to welfare. So altogether, the green welfare was achieved. But beyond QSO, if you keep your eyes peeled, you'll see that the social costs are higher than the social benefits. That means because we produce more than QSO, we've produced units that had higher social costs and social benefits, and so these units have actually been harmful. Just these units, right? Just the units that had costs higher than benefits, which are those above QSO. So we've kind of got a combination where some units actually added to create a really positive social benefit. That's all the units up to QSO. And then the units beyond QSO having higher costs and benefits actually ended up generating a kind of a bad impact to society. So the total welfare is the sum of all the welfare impacts, which is all the difference between all the benefits minus all the costs. And that's the sum of all the MSBs minus all the MSCs, giving you the green minus the red areas. Got here written down how I've worked that out. I've used method number 2. For welfare at the social optimum, you'll see very quickly there are no red shaded in areas, indicating that welfare had been lost because the costs were higher than the benefits. If you look at QSO, all the units that QSO involved producing, so like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up to QSO, all of those had benefits, social benefits higher than social costs. So all those units were actually contributing to welfare, and they were creating this green area in welfare that we have here. So in conclusion, the welfare at QSO is higher than the welfare at QFM. It's higher by those red areas. And that's why we get the welfare loss if you were to only produce or consume QFM is the red area, because that indicates that welfare has been lower than the social optimum by that red area. Lots of people like to just get like a shorthand way to just figure out where that triangle is. Here I've got the steps. Just look at the quantity between QFM and QSO. Kind of ignore everything else on the graph, and only between that quantity, highlight the shaded area between MSC and MSB. Okay, to eliminate this welfare loss, we know if you leave it to the free market will produce QFM, and that's going to be possibly bad because you're not maximizing welfare. You're leaving all this red area of welfare that you could have recuperated by producing at QSO. So it turns out a tax can help with this. So first of all, the tax is charged by the government, and the government will collect this tax revenue from the firm depending on how many units that they've made. This is going to increase the firm's marginal cost of production, and drawn here their firm's marginal private costs. That's going to mean that they're going to increase for every unit produced. The government is now charging them a fee, so every unit produced is now going to have higher marginal private costs. From MPC1 to MPC2, that's been shifted up because of the tax, so the height is the tax. As an example, at quantity 3, marginal private costs are 3, and because of the tax of 2, the total marginal private cost is now 5, illustrating how the tax increases the firm's marginal private cost, and that looks like a shift up. Therefore, the firm can only produce the same units at a higher price to be willing to sell. And you kind of scan to the next graph. This is going to mean that the supply curve is going to kind of shift to the left, and that shift left is going to cause changes in demand and supply, but essentially you're going to have a shortage because there's been less supply, and that shortage is going to give the firms an excuse to increase the price to help pay for that tax that they've got to pass on to the government later. So we're going to see an increase in the price from P1 to P2, a decrease in the quantity from Q1 to Q2, and in all this process there's been a shortage of supply, that's shown by the yellow, and at the same time there's been a contraction in demand, shown by the green. Okay, so now we apply this same diagram to the previous diagram, to the negative externality production graphs and the consumption graphs. It's the same thing, still shifts up the MPC by T. And if you draw this really carefully, so you will be able to draw it so that the new equilibrium that the firms and consumers that are selfish profit maximizers and utility maximizers, so they'll set MPP equal to MPC. That new equilibrium is going to be where QSO is. If you do this, kind of line that up really carefully. So line up your new MPC plus T equaling MPP at Q2. That's going to be your new equilibrium that will happen. We still think firms and consumers are selfish overall in this model, and as a result the equilibrium is going to be at P2 and Q2 as seen on these graphs. Turns out, because of this tax, there's actually no welfare loss anymore. This is slightly difficult to see because there's quite a lot going on into the graph. But if I were to just show you what the welfare is now that the market has been solved, just for this market, you can find the welfare as the difference between your MSB and your MSC for all the quantities produced. And I've highlighted that in here. And if you scan back up to the welfare at the social optimum, you will find that these are identical. They're identical actually because they're at the same quantity, and at that quantity you've gained all the same welfare. But you can double check that if you want, but that illustrates to you that there's no welfare loss. Welfare is at the optimum now. Okay, so in summary, a tax can achieve the social optimum quantity, even though you can have negative externalities in production or consumption. Those don't really go away, the externalities still happen, but you're just reducing quantity enough so that the costs aren't higher than the benefits anymore, and you're not just losing welfare overall. You can maximize welfare by producing at QSO, even with the help of the government, and the welfare can increase by this red triangle that we've previously seen. It will also generate tax revenue, which you'll see in a moment, which can be used to further fund intervention methods. There are some disadvantages to a tax, so it's going to shift firms' profits away to the government. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be better spent. Maybe the firm could have spent it really well. Harms consumer surplus because of the higher price, and it could create inequality because of these higher prices, especially if they're on necessities. To work out tax revenue, tax per unit times the units taxed. That's going to be this yellow box. The tax per unit is the gap between your MSC and your MPC, and the quantity taxed is the new quantity sold, which is Q2. The consumer incidence, we can work it out as the increase in the price times the unit sold, which is going to be P2 minus P1 times Q2, so that's going to give you this green area. Producer incidence is the kind of remaining tax revenue that the firm couldn't kind of get the consumers to pay for them. So it's this blue area remaining. Also, the success of this tax depends on the elasticity. If demand is really inelastic, a tax will typically have a smaller change in quantity. So if you want to reduce the quantity, it's going to be less effective if it's inelastic. And as a result, the government might have to use other policies to try and solve this market failure. It's possible that the tax doesn't change quantity very much if demand is inelastic, and that could lead to a lot of potential negatives with the policy having very little effectiveness. Remember that government failure is when government intervention leads to a greater welfare loss than gains. Okay, thank you so much. Hopefully that was useful to you. I know these ones are a little bit technical, joining everything together, but good job coming to this end, and catch you in the next video. Thank you so much. Bye!